You know, when I compared this show to Star Trek Prodigy, I didn't think it would straight up take a Star Trek trope. I'm referring to the duplicate worlds one, in case you were wondering. Hello, interwebs! I hope you are all doing well, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of Star Wars Skeleton Crew. This one, the 4th episode, which I believe is titled, I don't seem to remember, No Attin. Something along those lines. I can never remember these really long titles, so I guess that kind of fits the title of this episode. That'll be my excuse. I'm being clever. Also, 2 things before we get into this review. Number 1, if you can tell me where my outfit is from, I adore you and love you because you are one of my favorite people. And number 2, last week a lot of you called me out in the comments for a weird mistake that I made, and rightfully should have called me out, where I called Jude Law, I believe, Jared Leto, getting my JLs mixed up on that one, and rightfully I deserve to be called out for that. At least, I guess, I was gonna say at least I didn't call him Jay Leno, but I think Jay Leno might be better than Jared Leto. I don't know. Where do you rank your JL? It's like your Chris's in Hollywood. Where do you rank your JL actors? I think Jude Law is clearly at the top of that list. But regardless, let's get into the review of this episode. I actually think that this was the strongest episode of this show so far, mostly because it really, unlike the other 3 episodes of the show that we've had where they just really felt like they were moving the plot forward, had to just constantly be pushing things, and like every scene just kept moving things forward bit by bit by bit. This one felt like it slowed down, and while still pushing the mystery and plot of the series forward with its, central location that we get in this one, it also allowed it to just tell its own story and its own narrative. And it just allowed it to be a little episodic piece. And while I know the show is only, I think, like 8 episodes long, you can imagine a world where this structure becomes like a 20-episode structure for the series, where the kids jump off somewhere, land on a planet with Jod, and they do some exploring, and they have a little character adventure, and also a little Star Wars nonsense happens, and at the end of the day, we had a little fun time for 30 minutes. And it is very reminiscent, I've joked at the top, it is very reminiscent of the similar structure from Star Trek Prodigy. The only difference really is that Star Trek Prodigy, well, for the most part, it always kind of advanced its storylines. It did have episodes that were just sort of like one-offs that had nothing really to do with the ongoing arc of that series, especially in its first season. Whereas here, the setting of this episode still moves the plot forward a little bit, but it allows it to take a little bit of a backseat. And I think it does a great service to slowing down and giving us time with our characters and letting them be. And I said that last week, that was something that I really, really wanted. I think my only major negative with this episode, I have a couple little nitpicks here and there, but my only major negative, and it's not a huge detriment, is that we don't get a lot of time between the kids and Jod. For the most part, for 90% of this episode, the kids are off doing their own thing, and then Jod stays on the ship with 33. And as a result, we don't get to see that growing relationship between the 2 groups. Something I kind of want to see more of, especially since they're hinging so much of the mystery and tension amongst the crew between who Jod is, what are his motivations, and what the kids are doing. And I think it's just a little bit of a detriment to kind of sideline him from their dynamic for most of this episode. That being said, by doing so, it allowed them to focus more on the younger characters, and specifically Neil and Fern kind of get some central focus, Neil being more so. And I think that's the right thing to do. Like, if you're not going to focus on the dynamic between Jod and the kids, focusing on the individual kids and then giving them time to have character moments and shine, I think is absolutely the smart move. And on that note, I loved everything to do with Neil in this episode. Let's get into a little bit more specifics instead of saying general, and I'll talk more about Neil. But the kids land on where they think Attin is, but it turns out to be another world that is very, very similar to Attin, which, again, I like. It's evolving the mystery of the show, so we very clearly see that whatever Attin is, whatever project the Old Republic or the High Republic or whichever era of the Republic made them this project did, they were clearly doing multiple of them, and clearly had some sort of thing in mind. Now, what I like about them arriving on this world, and it seems so similar, and yet having seemingly devolved into chaos, whether it was like 2 sides fighting each other, 2 different tribes that presumably are made up of the former denizens of this very similar Attin suburban world. The question is sort of left open. was this intentional or not? Because there is a world, there is a version of this where it's like, this is just an experiment went wrong and everything got fucked up and they, now everything just fell apart and this is what resulted in that. There's also a world where maybe this simmering tensions between these groups was intentionally stoked to get to this point. And I think the comparison that I would bring, and possibly the two answers to this mystery, are like, are they just doing a suburban project of saying this is how we control the populace? Like the original project was just like, this is how we control the populace. We're doing multiple of these to just work out the kinks. In which case, like Attin surviving was like the end, like what they were aiming for in their society. This perfect, like quote unquote utopian, very kind of like domineering, sort of everyone fits in their roles, kind of fascist-y, kind of controlling capitalists, whatever domineering a system you want, but everyone sort of fits as cogs into the machine sort of world. Or we could have a situation where it's like the Fallout, spoiler for the Fallout TV show if you haven't seen it, but I played the video game, so like, this is just a regular touchstone for me. I don't mean to spoil the TV show for anyone. Skip ahead like 10 seconds or whatever. But as a video game person who just kind of knows this off the bat, it could be like the Fallout vaults, where each vault is like doing a different style of experiment. And Attin just happens to be the one that isn't a dystopian, or one of the few that isn't a dystopian. So I'm kind of curious. I like that question is left open in the air just by the presence of them arriving on this planet. And while we get that pretty instantaneously, and the kids kind of get that pretty instantaneously as well, it's never lingered on. Like there is a version of this episode where the whole thing is like, oh, why is this all very similar? Why is this all the same? Why are the two, like all these things just overtly expressed? And yet this show, just kind of like last episode, where it didn't over-focus on the kids believing that Jod was definitely 100% a Jedi. This episode doesn't lean on that either. And I like that the show and series so far has just respected the intelligence of its viewers, especially since it's a show for kids. You know, a lot of shows, when they make things for kids, don't sometimes tend to trust that children will get it, let alone adults sometimes, even more adult-focused shows. So I think I really do appreciate that. But what it allows us to do is you meet the society of, you know, these two warring tribes. I forget their names. I like these groups. They're a bit surface level to a degree, but there's enough like individual personality in them that I found worthwhile. Like the one group that we clearly get the most time with is like they venerate their children, but you again get this implication that the guy in charge is sort of saying that because he's using that to justify using child soldiers. He's saying like, we respect our children, but then he puts them out first in front to get them killed first. And Fern, as a kid who's supposed to be the captain, doesn't know how to really push back against that because she's a kid and she doesn't have the experience of like saying no to a guy like this. And so it's like, it's this really fucked up thing of like, yeah, they're using child soldiers. He's using children as fodder to protect himself. The guy's messed up. And yet again, the show doesn't like overtly draw attention to that fact other than like the situation just being kind of fucked up, but you get the implication because we see this other kid who has this very French Revolution accent. I love her accent going on there here, who's also part of the group and part of this war. And you see Neil, and this is what I really, really loved, and I love where they're going with it, it seems. Neil talking to her and saying, it sucks that you have to be in war all the time, and I wish you could end the cycle of us versus them, like you could just go and say you're sorry and end the fighting between the two groups. And I love this on a few different levels. Because one, it's just a nice message for kids of like, you don't have to constantly end up in fighting. You can stop this us versus them idea. But it's also secretly the core, like pushing back against the core idea of Star Wars. I've made video essays on my main channel about how Star Wars as a franchise sometimes ends up in this cycle of looping fights of like fascism comes up from neoliberalism fights, like rebels fight back, they form neoliberalism again, they fall, and then fascism rises again. And it's just this endless cycle of us versus them violence that the franchise, just because it's regurgitating its stories over and over again, fall into. And we live in a galaxy that is constantly at war. And here, this story is saying we can break that cycle, but on a mini scale. So there's like this interesting commentary on Star Wars as a franchise through this, but done in a very kids-focused way that gets at those core themes of what Star Wars is kind of doing, pushing back against it, critiquing it, but in a very subtle way that still feels very Star Warsian. I think that that's really, really smart. And on top of that, because I'm assuming, this is my guess, but like I'm assuming stuff with Neil and what is going on at Attin with their whole society, that their family, that the kids' own society, we'll see a relationship to that of like how this cycle of violence is kind of being enacted on their world in a different way. of their supervisor, their oppressor, sort of giving them roles and jobs that they are fitting into in a way that is its own sort of oppression and cycle of domination and control. And I think if the show ends up like kind of relating that idea, like maybe the kids sort of using the same sort of rhetoric later on, or thinking about it, or growing through character development through this show to get at that same idea. It doesn't need to be drawn explicitly, but like the same concept coming up. I think that's a really cool idea of like pushing back against suburbia and like neoliberal control and capitalism and all that sort of stuff, but in a kid-friendly way that's not like being the Star Wars-y, like let's talk about fascism and neoliberalism in very overt terms. I think it's really subtle and smart, and I just enjoyed it. And it allows that storyline to breathe because we don't have to over-focus on like the big plot goings on like we did last episode, which I thought was a detriment to a little bit of that episode's pacing. On top of that, we get a nice resolution with the kid where the kid sort of says, like, I want to focus on peace. Like, I hope this comes back around. Like, I feel like there needed a little bit more resolution with this other kid that they meet, but we don't get as much of it. But then this brings us over to John. And like I said, I was a little sad that he was sidelined, but I did like his stuff with 33, where 33 set the babysitting protocol and said, come on, baby, get up here. Like, hilarious, adorable, loved that. But then him working with Smee to try and see if he can get his memory, Smee, I keep saying Smee now, 33, getting his memory sort of jogged up and then Jod getting captured. Now, here's the other question that's left open to implication. It's like Jod comes back and saves them and like buys, seems to have bought their, the animals that the other group was coming in to fight for. But the question is, why did he buy them in the first place? Why did he buy those animals at all? Did he know that he was going to need to trade them for the kids? Also, do we really buy that he was able to get out of that situation? That he just bought the animals off of them? They had him surrounded. They could have just taken everything he owned. So there's an implication that potentially Jod killed them all with potentially force powers or not. That'd be dark. It might be a way to go, but like because we don't see that happening, and he just tells us that it happens, we shouldn't entirely trust this guy. So again, I like that it's not drawn overt attention to, but it's there. So again, just smart little building throughout all of this. But I also loved his interactions with 33. But this leads us to the end of the episode where they go up in the supervisor tower, and clearly we see there are many of these planets, but obviously Attin was the one specifically that got struck off, and we learn why 33 didn't remember anything, because his memory had intentionally been closed off by his previous captain. And Fern, after having a nice existential crisis, I really liked that too, of like her questioning her leadership. I like this. She didn't get as much focus in this episode, but it was a little bit of like, she feels like she's less of a leader. And I like that sort of anxiety coming out for her. She figures out the situation and she's able to get the information, but then 33 turns on them. And so again, some questions being laid here of like, why just at Attin? Again, it kind of goes back to the possibilities of what's going on here, because there's many planets that why just at Attin was the one that was destroyed. Was it just that the captain only wanted to go to Attin and didn't care about the other ones? Feels like weird if that's the case, because they would all probably have treasure. Why not save them all and take all the coordinates for yourself? But we do know now why the ship was on Attin, because they were looking for it specifically. So curious on where that goes. Obviously, they fight 33. I like that Neil ends up saving the day by getting into a fight, but not a fight just to get revenge, but a fight to protect. Again, going back to that idea of we shouldn't fight against something, we should be fighting for something. We do fight, but we fight for something. Again, getting at these really cool ideas of resistance and pushing back. Because if you're just fighting against something, you're not fighting for an ideal. And so I like that he was fighting to protect. Loved that. Very subtle, but it's there. Again, the show is like actually decently subtle about its themes and ideas, and yet they are there, and I really like them. But the only thing I didn't love about this is that they managed to, that Jod turns off 33, and I'm like, when did droids just have a turn off button? Like, I know they do. I think we've seen it in a C-3PO. I'd have to go back and look, but I believe we have. But it's like, man, if a lot of like fighting droids just had a turn off button, would have made a lot of Star Wars a lot easier. So I thought that was a little convenient, but whatever. It allows 33 to survive and not be blown up, because I do like his character a lot. So I'm assuming they'll fix him up and reprogram or whatever, which I always hate reprogramming droids because I love my droids. And they deserve to fight back against their oppressors and not be reprogrammed. But that's a longer discussion for another day, not this show. So that was just one thing. I was like, okay, it's a little convenient, but we'll live with it to allow 33 to continue being a character that I enjoy. I think that's everything that I had. Like I said, this is a strong episode. I think if the series kind of keeps this format going forward of like, now that we've gotten all the plot set up, we've got all our characters, we do like episodic stories here and there until we get to the finale, where we like move the plot forward a little bit more here, but not too fast. Then we get like little one-off adventures for each of our kids and characters, and then we get the finale, which will tie everything together. I think it'd be an absolutely wonderful structure. I just think the only thing I really want is just a more dynamic and interactions between Jod and the kids that really sort of builds up their trust and understanding of him, while also building up the potential for him to not be trustworthy, which we got a little of in this episode, but not a ton. That's everything. I hope you all enjoyed this review. I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and I will see you all for the next one, and I hope you all live long and prosper.